Welcome back, everyone. I was thinking about the Roman Empire today. I know it's an ongoing joke, and actually I learned about that from my kids months ago when they asked me how often I thought about the Roman Empire. Well, I think about it a lot, especially after a couple of trips to Rome itself and seeing firsthand some of the incredible history that exists in Italy and elsewhere related to the Roman Empire. So we're taking a look today at Simple History and their video that came out about a week ago called Roman Punishments Were So Much Worse Than You Think. I'll confess that beyond crucifixion, which I know much more about because of being a Christian and being a pastor than I do because of history, and then of course the idea of decimation, which some of us are familiar with from Roman history, I honestly don't know a lot about what Roman punishments were. So I'm excited to learn, but also offer some commentary where appropriate about all of this. And before we dive into this one today, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Thomas in Randers, Denmark, who signed up as one of our latest patrons last month. Thank you so much, Thomas. Could not do this without you. Let's dive into this one.
Empires aren't built by being nice. Now, publicly executing criminals is nothing new, but ancient Rome took torture and criminal justice to levels of astonishing creativity that are hard to rival. Sure, they did have simple beheadings, and there's also the infamous Tarpeian Rock, a cliff face in Rome that convicted traitors were hurled off of.
Here's the deal, and this is the reality of most of human history, is that executions were done as much, if not more, for the people witnessing them as they were for the criminal. I use that in quotes because sometimes what makes a criminal depends on who's deciding what makes a criminal. But this was about sending a message. This was all very much about deterrent. And so certain crimes had especially heinous punishments for the simple fact that you wanted to make sure nobody else made the same mistake that that person did. So you come up with these things like the Tarpeian Rock in Rome as a place that becomes associated with executions of heinous crimes, because then anytime anybody walks past there or anybody visits the city, you point to that and say, there's the famous Tarpeian Rock, and you know what happens there. And that's something that becomes a propaganda tool that you use to spread a message.
Methods of punishment weren't always enough, however, and the Romans wasted no time in devising other means for when they really wanted to send a message. By far, the most famous method of execution used by the Romans was crucifixion. The idea of attaching someone to a slab of wood didn't start with Rome, and was used by the Persians, Seleucids, and Carthaginians. In Rome, crucifixion was used mostly to punish slaves, disgraced soldiers, foreigners, and pirates, and was rarely used against Roman citizens.
It's something we forget about when it comes to the Romans is that as much as they did a lot of conquering and assimilating people into the Roman culture and trying to Romanize people, they also borrowed a lot of things from the people that they conquered or even the people that they encountered in combat. People they didn't conquer. They would get ideas from them, just as people would get ideas from the Romans about how to fight and about how to organize their society. Anytime you came in contact with other people groups, there's shared culture that takes place.
The crucifixion process usually started with scourging or whipping of the victim, who was then forced to carry their cross to the place of execution. It was likely that the condemned criminal didn't actually carry the entire cross, but just the crossbeam, with the upright post of the cross fixed permanently in place. The victim's arms would then be attached to the crossbeam. This could be done by driving nails into the wrists of the victim, or the arms could be tied on. It was also possible that the arms would be draped over the back of the beam and tied or nailed in place.
There's a good chance that they experimented with different ways of doing it. We think a lot about the wrist being the place where the nail would go just because it seems like it would hold better. But there could have been a lot of different ways it was done over time. Same with the crosses. I mean, you could deal with an entire cross, but the cross beam is going to be pretty heavy in and of itself, and it makes a lot of sense logistically if you have permanently attached poles, if you're doing a lot of crucifixions, and you just hang the cross beam.
The beam was then raised up and attached to the upright post, with the feet tied or nailed to it. There is surprisingly little direct information about how exactly crucifixion was carried
That's
out, with the placement of the limbs and the number of nails and their location still debated by scholars. More than likely, there was no specific way to do it, and executioners spiced things up as they went along. Once on the cross, the victim would survive in agony anywhere from a few hours to several days. They would endure shock, blood loss, dehydration, and exposure, and as time went on, they would suffer from slowed blood circulation. Death would finally come due to asphyxiation, since being forced to remain in this suspended position causes tremendous strain on the diaphragm and the
Yeah, so the best understanding I have of how death from asphyxiation happens is that the position you were on the cross actually required you to push up on your feet, which were nailed, in order to be able to exhale because of all the pressure being put on the diaphragm. And so obviously as time goes on and you're weakening, it's a lot harder to do that. And that's why they would actually, and it's actually described in the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, that they came along to break the legs of the condemned, because by breaking the legs of the condemned, they could no longer push up and they would die a lot faster. So it was a way to hasten death.
Rest of the respiratory system. The condemned would try to keep breathing by pressing down with their legs, which would relieve the pressure. They would normally be left in this state until they died, but if the executioners wanted it to end quickly, they would break the legs of the condemned, which would make inhaling difficult and speeding along the process. Once dead,
my understanding, though, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but from study I've done of it, it's actually exhaling that was the issue, not inhaling.
the bodies could be taken down and the cross, or at least the upright beam, would be used again for another prisoner. But in many cases, the bodies would be left attached until they decayed. At the top of the cross, there would be a placard with the name of the criminal and the crimes committed. The entire spectacle, a gory reminder of the power and might of Rome, and the consequences for defiance. By far, the most infamous examples of crucifixion was the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, who was executed sometime in the first half of the 1st century. The largest mass crucifixion was recorded in 71 BC, when the Spartacus revolt was crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus. In order to keep Rome's slaves in line, Crassus had 6,000 of the survivors crucified along a section of the Appian Way, stretching from Capua to Rome, an undeniable display of Roman power.
Right, and this is the whole point, again, is that it's not just enough that you execute someone, you need to send a message to other potential breakers of that law, so that they don't do the same thing because they don't want to end up that way.
Crucifixion was used as a torture and execution method until the early 4th century AD, when the newly Christianized empire ended the practice for obvious reasons. If crucifixion was a drawn-out and agonizing...
So I love this...
obvious reasons.
Let me go back to this. I love this depiction of the Flavian Amphitheater, what we call the Colosseum, because the reason it's called the Colosseum is that on one side of it was... the site of the Colosseum was originally where Nero had a very famous palace. Of course, by the time you have the Flavians come to power, Nero is dead, and... you had the year of the 4 emperors, and eventually settles on the Flavians. And so the palace is gone, but this Colossus, this statue of Nero, is there. And so next to the Colossus was built the Flavian Amphitheater, which got nicknamed the Colosseum because of its proximity to the Colossus.
Crucifixion was a drawn-out and agonizing way to die. The Romans had another method that was faster, but much more gory, and sated the desire of the Roman masses for bloodlust and spectacle. During the matches in the Colosseum or other amphitheaters, public executions would be one of the attractions during the games. In addition to other methods of capital punishment, damnatio ad bestias befell the condemned,
death by
meaning
beast.
Condemnation to beasts. It's exactly what it sounds like. Take the condemned criminal, place him in the arena in front of thousands of screaming patrons, and release a hungry beast to eat them.
And the animals were a huge part of the games that went on in places like the Colosseum, and it wasn't just in the Colosseum. A lot of this stuff took place at the Circus Maximus, which wasn't far away and was much bigger and could hold a lot more people, and was right in front of the giant palace, so the emperor could kind of watch from his palace if he wanted to. But yeah, they had different kinds of games all throughout the day, and you learn a lot about this when you go to the Colosseum itself. It's a fascinating place to visit. And it would kind of culminate in the middle of the day with the public executions that would take different forms. And it was kind of an all-day spectacle, but they didn't have games all the time. There wasn't like a, everyday kind of thing for years on end. It was maybe every day for a couple of months, or even every day for a couple of weeks, or maybe a few days, and then nothing for a long time.
That's pretty much it. There were some variations on how it could be done, of course. For example, the prisoner might have a weapon, so they had the illusion of a chance to survive, or they could be chained in place and unarmed. Whatever the organizer or editor of the games thought would keep the crowd's attention.
Editor, yeah, that's what they were called.
In some cases, the organizers would have had a flair for the dramatic.
And this was a big and I love the attention to detail with things like this. You go to some of the great museums, even places like the British Museum, and you can see this exact kind of pottery, those exact colors. It's really, really cool stuff. The editor of the games, you can see some parallels if you're familiar with the Hunger Games, and you've seen that, and you have someone who's kind of the game master. That's kind of who the editor was, and they would come up with these ideas that would entertain the crowd, but also satisfy the wishes of the emperor.
Literally. Elaborate sets would be constructed, and scenes from plays or mythological stories would be acted out, with the condemned actually being killed by the beasts. Damnatio ad Bestias was closely associated with the wild animal hunts, venationes, where exotic animals would be brought into the arena to be hunted by gladiators, specialist hunters, or each other.
And the hunts were much, much more common than gladiator fights to the death were, even though those are the things we often think of when we think of places like the Colosseum.
Spectacle was the priority, not practicality. Animals from the far corners of the Roman sphere of influence would be used. These most famously included lions, most likely the Barbary lion, as well as leopards, bears, and crocodiles. The condemned would also be trampled to death by elephants, bulls, and wild boars. The problem with this is that wild animals don't really care what the arena organizers expect from them and would often refuse to perform. Humans are not a natural prey animal, and even the largest and fiercest of predators would be frightened by thousands of screaming spectators. To keep the blood flowing, Rome relied heavily on specialized animal handlers called bestiari to prepare the animals. Before entering the arena, the animals would be starved. Desperate and hungry, the animals would fall on the condemned prisoners, ripping them apart while the crowd shouted their approval.
The crocodiles, that's a famous scene in the new Gladiator movie that came out this last year. There's clear evidence that there were games involving water in the early years of the Flavian Amphitheater. We know that they could fill it to something like 4.5 feet of water in about 20 minutes, and there was an elaborate system for pumping the water in. But within not too many years after the amphitheater opened, they built the underground parts to it, which you can still see to this day, where they even had like elevators that would kind of raise up and you could go up into. And once that happened, the idea is that probably there weren't any more water games in there. So the setting that you have for movies like Gladiator 2, where you have the water games, probably wasn't still happening at that point in Roman history.
This practice continued until sometime in the 4th century, ending since the gladiatorial games were waning in popularity anyway. But more to the point, the number of animals sent to the arena over the centuries was so great that the Romans were running out of wild animals to capture.
Well, and not only that, but after you get to the early part of the 2nd century AD under emperors like Trajan, the Roman Empire kind of hits its peak. And it's not really conquering any new ground. In fact, under folks like Hadrian, they start kind of shrinking and pulling back to strengthen the empire. So you're not conquering new places. You're not getting access to new exotic animals and new people that you can enslave and things like that. And so the ability to feed things into these games kind of wanes.
The carnage of the arena caused one of the greatest ecological disasters in history. Damnatio ad Bestias wasn't the only time the Romans outsourced their punishments to the animal kingdom. In the ancient Roman mind, the worst crime that can be committed was parricide, killing one's parents or other close relative. Such a heinous crime required an equally brutal punishment. Many of these criminals would be thrown to the beasts, but sometimes, rarely, they would experience something that was far, far worse. Called poena cullae, or punishment of the sack, the criminal would be tied in a sack and thrown into a river to drown. Some executioners thought this wasn't nearly cruel enough. Thrown in the sack with him would be a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. Once thrown in, the panicking animals would claw and bite at the man, compounding his suffering as he eventually drowned. According to the Roman historian Livy, around 101 BCE, Publicius Malleolus was the first man executed by this method, stating that he was tied to a sack and then thrown into the sea after killing his mother. But there is no mention of any animal involvement. The first mention of using animals came centuries later. Sometimes only snakes were used. Try wrangling an irate dog, monkey, rooster, and snake at the same time and see how it goes.
Yeah.
Strangely, well after Rome's fall, the practice was brought back in the Middle Ages and early modern era. In 1548, a millman was executed by a sack filled with all sorts of animals, but only a cat and a dog managed to escape.
This is one of those situations where you had somebody ruling some town somewhere who read an account from Roman history and thought, you know what? I'm going to try this, and then brought it back.
Like what happened in Rome, the punishment was rarely carried out and was used more as a deterrent than an actual practice. At its height, Rome controlled up to a quarter of the world's population, and they did it with an iron fist and more than a little deranged creativity.
All right, that was interesting. I definitely learned some things I didn't know about, learned a little bit more about some of the things I did. What is some, let's say, interesting examples of punishments from history that you think we should be talking about and learning more about? Let me know in the comment section below. And I want to give a shout out and a thank you to John Burns in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and Thomas Charbonnel in Hong Kong. Thank you for your support on Patreon. If you want to learn more about how you can support the channel, and I promise you it goes a long, long way to helping keeping this channel going. You can click on the link in the description below to check out the Patreon. Thanks for watching.